Hello and welcome back. As you can see, we're enjoying a late winter's sunny day in Sydney, but we're still locked down with the coronavirus. In today's video, we're going to look at what we can do with selections and masks in Photoshop. So let's get started. One of the reasons why we use Photoshop is so that we can make very precise and targeted adjustments to selected parts of an image. To do this, we need to be able to make and modify a mask, either a very precise mask or in some other cases a very simple mask. In this section we're going to look at how to make a mask that is very precise, because we're going to replace the sky in this image on the screen. So there are many tools in Photoshop that we can use to make a selection, and some of them work better than others, and in this case we're going to do a very simple selection and just use the quick selection tool and select the sky. So we'll pick up the quick selection tool from our toolbar, making sure that we've clicked on the plus to add to a selection, click and drag over the sky, and the software will pretty quickly find most of the area that we want to include. But if we zoom in and look around here, it's been fooled by this part of the tree that's running down, and so it hasn't picked up these things. That's why we need to start to try and pick up some of these other smaller areas. Now, one thing that you'll find very quickly is that we've got a whole lot of small areas of sky peeking through this tree, and if we try and select them all manually, we're going to be here forever. So there are better tools for refining this selection. Once we've made a fairly broad brush initial selection, let's just fill in a couple of more areas, and then we'll go in and we'll use the select and mask option to refine the mask. So with any of the selection tools used, we can go and click on select and mask from the top toolbar, and this takes us into the secondary tool that allows us to really refine the masking. Now in this case we're going to use the refine edge tool, and because we've got a lot of blue poking through that sky, I'm going to make my selection tool quite large, and I'm initially just going to paint very broadly over the tree to try and pick up the larger areas first. And if you do this, paint, click and hold with your left hand, left mouse button, and allow the software to catch up, you'll see pretty quickly it's already made a fairly good selection. But in able to refine this even more, we are probably going to need to go in and do a little bit more work. Let's just have a look at this. If we click OK, it will take us back to our image, and we'll see that now we've got quite a lot of the areas of sky selected, but there are other areas that need a little bit more refinement, such as these pieces coming down from the mangrove and some of the edges of the water, and we've missed a few in here. So we can just simply go back in to our select and mask and refine this even more. This time we'll reduce our brush down to a much more manageable size using the square bracket keys. The left hand square bracket key reduces the size of the brush, the right hand increases the size. So using a smaller size brush, we can just paint across the edges that we want to be refined, and you'll see if you give the software a second or two to catch up, it will fill those in. And even if I paint on this missing frond, it will gradually fill them in. To refine this, you just need to have a little bit of patience, do a small area at a time, paint it in, and it will refine this mask very carefully for you. And so we can go over more areas and gradually fill in the bits that the initial selection has failed to pick up. Now in doing this, you need to spend just a little bit of time to get it working very well, otherwise you'll end up with an unsatisfactory result. So just spend a little bit of time and just go through and fill in those areas, and in cases where there might have been other areas missed, we can just paint over and it will pick up those selections. Click OK again to go back to our image, and we'll see that we're looking pretty good now, and then there's a little bit more work we can do to refine that. So let's say that we've spent a fair bit of time getting this far, there's a couple of ways we can modify this mask other than the selected mask tool. A simple way to visualize what your mask is doing is to use the quick mask overlay, which hides down below the black and white squares on the left hand side of your toolbar. So if you click that, it will actually give you a mask overlay to show you the areas that have been masked. And here we can see that we've missed some of the hanging down pieces from the mangrove, and we've got a bit of sky still left in here. And the rest of it is not looking too bad. There's a few areas here that need to be refined, and I'd like to include the ship in this selection, and it's not quite right either, so we can go back in. If we turn that back off, it takes us back to our mask overlay. We can go back into select and mask and continue to pick up those areas and refine them. So worthwhile spending a little bit of time getting this right. Click OK, take you back to the image. When you've really refined this and got it working the way you want, most importantly, save the selection. And you do that by going up to the top menu to the select menu, select, save selection, give it a name. I'm going to call it Sky because that's what I've selected, and it's a new channel. We click OK. And then if you do some more further refining of this, you can simply go in and save over that selection. So before we go and look at alternative ways to modify the mask, let's just pop back into the select and mask menu and have a look at a couple of the other options here. As we've seen, we can paint in using the refine edge mask, and if we are able to look a little more closely at some of these other options on the right hand side, we have a radius option for our edge detection. So what we want to do if we're doing a very precise selection is to keep that radius at a very small level because we want to pick up the finest detail, and we can even tick the box that says a smart radius that allows the software to pick up the smaller areas and adjust the size accordingly. Now also we have an option here to smooth our selections out. If we have a jagged edge and we really want to smooth that out, we can feather the selection. But of course in this case we really don't want to feather the selection, because if we do that we've lost all of the precise selections that we've done, so we're not going to use that. And we can adjust using the contrast slider, will allow us to pick out areas where there may not be sufficient contrast between the selection and the background, and adjusting this will allow you to do a little bit more refinement without actually having to do any more brushwork. And finally, in this selection of options, we have an option to shift the edge of the mask, and that allows us to effectively expand or contract the mask by a small amount just to pick up any halos or edges that we might find. When we're all done with that, we go OK to go back to our image. Now that we're back at our image, we've got our mask overlay sitting over the image. Now we're going to have a look at how we can refine this selection around this ship. It's a fair way off in the distance and therefore a little bit lost in the haze, so let's just see how we could refine that. The first tool we might want to try and use is our quick selection tool. This time we want to take a bit away from the selection, so we're going to go and choose the minus tool, and you'll see here that the brush size now is very small. I've got it down to 8 pixels, and if I use that, it's going to very carefully select the values around what I'm selecting, and you'll see that it's very quickly can get out of hand, and of course I've got a very hazy object I'm trying to select in any event, so this is where we might run into a bit of trouble, and we may have to do some more work with refining the selection. The rest of it is not looking too bad. It's a little bit rough, but let's just try and fix up this little bit here. So I use my shift key to change to a plus arrow or plus selection tool temporarily, and I'll try and paint that in and try and paint that in there. Now it's a little bit improved, so that's great. What I'm going to do now is go back and save my selection, save selection. Now I'm not going to make a new channel, I'm going to just replace the existing one. So I click here, come down to my selection Sky, and I'm going to replace the channel. OK, so now I've got my ship a little bit better selected. Let's go back and have another look with the quick mask overlay to see how this is going to look, and you'll see there are still a few little spots I need to refine, so I'll go back and do that. We won't bore you with looking at that in fine detail, and we'll move on to the next step. let's turn that off and go back to our selection. Okay, we're back at our image now, and let's have another look at how our selection has improved. Now, the thing that we want to do in this image is we want to be able to replace that sky, so it's important that we pick up all of those areas in that selection that we want. And let's just have a quick look with the quick mask overlay. We can see now that our sky is looking pretty good. I've been back and I've refined those couple of areas that were missing. There are a couple of little blemishes here, and the horizon edge is a little bit rough in places. So look, there's a very quick way to just pick up those couple of little spots, and while we've got this quick mask overlay in place, we can just simply go to our paintbrush, and again, using our square brackets keys, we can choose to paint on the mask, and we go X to make the foreground black and paint black onto the mask. The mask area showing in red is the area that is not selected, and I'm just going to pick up those couple of areas. There's a couple of areas here of the water that were not picked up, and you'll see here a little bit of that edge of that ship is not quite terribly well selected, so we can just simply use our little brush tool, being mindful that if we're using a soft edge brush, we need to be fairly careful with how we apply that, and I think that's going to be nearly good enough. Let's just zoom back, and there's a couple of other little spots here that have been picked up. These were a little bit similar to the color of the sky, and so the software's managed to pick that up, and we can just do this manually, paint those in. A few quick brush strokes and we're in business, and again fix up those, and I think everything's looking pretty good. Go back out of quick mask tool, go back up to select, save selection. We're not going to make a new selection, we're going to just replace that one, and now we can really see whether this is going to work when we try and replace the sky. So with that selection active, and I've got my background layer here, normally it would be called background layer, but I've been playing around with this image, so I've made duplicates, and so it's now no longer called background. If you're working on your background layer and you have a padlock symbol here, just simply click on that padlock symbol to allow you to edit this layer. Come down and click on the add mask selection here, and you'll see that, oh, we've got our mask the wrong way around, of course. So let's just go up to the mask properties and invert that. So now we actually have a selection of the tree, and the sky is now transparent, and we see transparency behind. So now to drop in our sky, to replace the existing sky, I've got a sample sky here, which is from somewhere else in the world. To drag that sky into that image, we simply go to the Move tool at the very top of your toolbar. You can see it's called the Move tool. Come down onto the image, hold down your left mouse key and don't release it. Click and hold that down, and then you'll drag that image up, and we'll come over to our image that we're going to work on. Don't release the button yet. Come down onto the image and now release it. And you'll now see that I've got a new layer sitting above here, and one of the first problems we see is that the image resolution of the image I brought in is a little bit lower than the one I'm working on, so therefore the image is a bit smaller. But for this example, because we're just using the sky, it's not too much of an issue, so we're just going to stretch this out now to fill the area that we want to use on the image. So with this layer selected, we go up to Edit, Transform, Scale, and if you're using the new version of Photoshop, by default the proportions will be locked, and if you want to change that, you just simply hold down the Shift key and you can change the proportions. So as it is now, the proportions are locked. If I hold down the Shift key and drag, you'll see that I can distort the background. In this case, I don't really care. I just want to cover the background that is masked out, and I really want that mountain to disappear out of the image, so I'll move that down somewhere here. Now the image is now much larger than my canvas size, but that doesn't matter. Click on the tick button to say OK, and we now have our sky sized to where we want it. But the problem is we can't see our background image because our sky image is sitting on top. So to fix that, we just simply come down to our layers panel, click onto the new sky layer and drag it down below the background layer, and all of a sudden we have our sky filling in. Now let's just zoom in and have a look and see how good our selection is. At this level of detail, it's looking pretty good. There are a few minor areas that are not quite right, but by and large it's pretty good. So let's just say that we're going to just quickly refine that a little bit more. So let's just go back to our image, go back and load our selection, and we want the sky as our selection. Click OK, and now that we've got the sky as the selection, what I want to do is I want to expand this selection just a little bit, just to fill in these little bits of white area. So what we can do is go up to the select menu, click on select, modify, and then we have several options. What we're going to do here, we're going to expand that selection by, let's just try 3 or 4 pixels to start with. We can go and do this again and click OK, and we can see, oh, that was a little bit too much. Edit, undo, expand, come back, select, modify, expand. We're only talking about, say, 2 pixels, and that's sufficient. And in fact it's actually a little bit too large. So now we'll go up to select, modify, and feather that, and we'll feather it by 2 pixels, the same amount that we expanded. So we've got a softer edge on there. And what we'll now do with that selection active, I'm now going to delete this layer mask from this image layer. So I've selected the mask, right mouse click, delete the layer mask. We now no longer have the layer mask in place, and with this new selection active, I'm just going to click to add that as a mask, and we'll see again, what have we done? We've inverted it. So we need to just go back in and invert that mask, and we can see that we've made a terrible mess of that. We'll have to go back and start again. Now that we've made a complete mess of that mask modification, let's go back and see how we can fix that up. So rather than go back and start again, we can just simply go to our history tab in Photoshop, and it records every step that you do. And if you look down here, somewhere down here, yes, we expanded and feathered the mask. So let's just go back to before we expanded that, and that will take us in history back to where we were before we did that modification that messed it up. So now let's just go up and with selection active, select, modify, expand, and I'm just going to go by 1 pixel, and I'm going to go back in again, select, modify, and feather by 1 pixel. So that should give us a sufficiently soft edge. And again, with that selection active, we now have gone back to the original layer mask. So we select that layer mask, right mouse click, delete that layer mask, again with our selection active, create the layer mask, and as we know, it was inverted, so we can just click simply to invert it, and now our selection is looking perfect. Now there will be still issues where there are some sharper lines and edges around, and we can simply modify this or refine it by overlaying our mask over our image. Rather than reloading the image, I think we're looking pretty good. There are a couple of areas there that might have been lost a little bit, but when we look at the image overall, it's not looking too bad. Let's just load that mask over the image so we can see where there are areas that we might want to modify. So again, click once on the mask to select it. Now hold down the Alt key or Option key on a Mac, and then click the mask again, and that will now load the mask over the image so that we can really see it at full scale, and we can see where there are areas that need a little modification. So we go back to our trusty brush tool. In this case, we know we've got white and black. We can just simply click X to swap our keys over. And remember, if you're using a soft brush, one of these soft round brushes, make sure you're using a very small brush so that you're not feathering those edges inadvertently. Where we're working in the middle of a large area of white doesn't really matter. and so we can come in, and I think I can paint that out. I can paint those areas through, but once we get up towards the edge of the horizon, we have to be a little bit more careful. And we can see over here there's a couple more areas I didn't fix up beforehand, and I can just simply paint away on here. Now if I inadvertently go too far and I go across the edge, you'll see that I'm starting to get a softer edge, and at this stage I'm painting with 100% opacity. We can come back and change that if we want. When you've finished playing around with that painting on the mask, we can now come back over to the layers palette, hover over again the mask icon, hold down Alt, click again, and it takes us back to our image, and we've now got our sky and our mask refined to the point where it's acceptable. I think in this case I would probably have left it without expanding that mask. So let's just go back in here, and here's a trick. We can, rather than go back and reload that mask, we've got this mask applied to the layer. When we go to the properties panel, we see we have a select and mask option, and what can I do? I can shift that edge backwards or forwards. So if I move it all the way one way, you'll see that I'm moving it inwards, and likewise I'm moving it outwards. Don't panic if we just come back, double click on the word shift edge, reverts it to 0. I just want to move it by 1% or 2% outwards. Let's go OK, and now let's see how we're going. That's looking much better. So with a few selections and a few different tools, we can really get a very refined selection and end up with an image that looks pretty good in the final analysis. In the next video, we'll look at some simpler ways of applying selections and masks to your images. And so when you're ready, come back and have a look at selections and masks part 2. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks for watching.